It was supposed to be just another quiet night, but one glance, one touch, and everything between us shifted forever. I never thought silence could be so loud. There was something about that quiet evening that unsettled me more than any storm ever had. The living room was dim, shadows flickering gently from the glow of a nearby lamp. Outside, rain tapped against the windows in soft, steady rhythms. It should have been peaceful, comforting even, but instead, it felt like the stillness was hiding something underneath. Growing up, Rowan had always been part of my life in a way that few others were. He was the kind of sibling who never wandered too far from my side. Whether I was heading out for school or just sitting on the porch doing nothing, he found a way to be there, sometimes silent, sometimes annoyingly inquisitive, but always there. It was just the way things were. Over time, most siblings I knew had grown apart, developed their own circles, carved their own paths. But Rowan stayed close. Maybe it was the way our household operated. Too many arguments behind closed doors, too many things left unsaid. We learned early that sticking together made things more bearable. There was safety in closeness. But lately, something had shifted. Not abruptly, not in a way I could clearly define. It crept in slowly, through small, almost invisible changes that were easy to dismiss, but hard to ignore once noticed. The way he laughed now seemed just a bit off-key. The way his eyes lingered a little too long, or how his presence felt heavier, like it carried more weight than before. I couldn't say exactly what changed, only that something had. That night, our parents had left for a short getaway, leaving the house unusually still. It was just Rowan and me, alone in that silence. I was scrolling through my phone, curled up at one end of the couch, when he entered the room, carrying 2 mugs. Without a word, he handed one to me with a quiet smile. It was a familiar gesture, but something in the simplicity of it felt significant. I thanked him, keeping my tone light, trying to maintain the easy atmosphere we were used to. He sat down beside me, not quite too close, but noticeably nearer than usual. The cushion gave under his weight, and I could feel a subtle shift in the air. We exchanged words, mundane things, really. A recent movie, a bad day at school, the rain. The kind of surface-level conversation that masked whatever neither of us was willing to say out loud. Then came one of those sudden dives into nostalgia. He brought up a summer we'd spent at a lakeside cabin, one of the rare moments from childhood untouched by chaos. I smiled at the memory. He'd struggled to learn how to swim, and I'd spent hours in the water with him, coaxing him along, laughing at his dramatic splashes and exaggerated gasps. It was a time when life had felt simple: sun, water, shared jokes. But the quiet that followed the memory was different. It lingered longer than it should have. Rowan's eyes held something deeper than the usual warmth of shared recollection. His hand, resting on the couch, edged closer to mine in a way that wasn't casual. Our fingers barely brushed, accidental maybe, or maybe not. The contact, though brief, made the room feel warmer, not from the lamp or the tea, but from something less tangible. My heartbeat picked up, out of sync with the easy rhythm of the moment. I tried to chalk it up to overthinking, but that excuse was starting to wear thin. He asked if I ever thought about how life would have been different if our home had been calmer, less chaotic. I gave a vague answer, staring at the window where raindrops trickled down the glass like tears. We both knew our upbringing had shaped us in strange ways, bonding us closer than most siblings. Maybe too close, sometimes. There was something about his voice then, soft, edged with sadness, that caught me off guard. When I turned to look at him, I found his gaze already on me, steady and unreadable. His fingers moved slightly, brushing mine again in a way that wasn't accidental this time. My instinct told me to pull away, and I did, if only barely, enough to give space, enough to not acknowledge what had just happened. A half laugh escaped me, an attempt to dissolve the tension. But the moment remained, hovering in the air between us. The storm outside began to roar, thunder rolling in the distance, making the walls vibrate faintly. And yet, inside the room, it was the silence that spoke louder. He broke it with a murmur, not quite a confession, but not far from it. Words about not needing to be taken care of. About wanting things to be different. I didn't know how to respond. Not really. So I just sat there, watching his hand retreat slowly from where it had been resting on mine. Eventually, he stood. His steps down the hallway were soft, but they echoed. I didn't follow. I stayed on the couch, my tea untouched and cooling. The sound of the closing door felt like a chapter ending, or perhaps something just beginning. I didn't yet know which. The days following that quiet, rain-soaked evening brought a silence that was no longer peaceful. It was the kind of silence that lingered long after words had been withheld, dense and almost suffocating. Every shared space between Rowan and me now felt charged, as if the air around us had thickened, carrying everything unsaid like static waiting to spark. We didn't speak about that night. We didn't have to. Something had shifted, and even in the absence of acknowledgement, we both moved differently. There was a new carefulness to how we sat, how we looked at one another, even how we passed each other in the hallway. I became hyper-aware of his presence in ways that unsettled me. Every glance he gave me felt loaded. Every slight touch, accidental or not, resonated longer than it should have. I found myself remembering moments that should have been meaningless. The way his fingers had brushed mine on the couch. The depth in his voice when he spoke of wanting things to be different. The sadness in his smile when he said goodnight. These moments played on repeat in my mind like scenes from a film I wasn't supposed to be watching. One afternoon, I found Rowan sitting on the floor just outside my room. He was hunched over a notebook, his posture guarded, like he'd been debating whether to knock or walk away. He didn't say anything at first. Neither did I. I sat beside him, the wall cool behind my back, the quiet pressing in. Eventually, he began to speak. His voice was low, steady, but carried a vulnerability that cut through the space between us. He acknowledged the tension, the strangeness, not with direct words, but with enough weight that I understood what he meant. It wasn't just in my head. He'd felt it too. He didn't have a solution, and neither did I. There was no grand confession, no dramatic declaration. Just two people caught in the swirl of something they didn't know how to name. I reached for his hand without fully realizing it. The gesture was instinctive, not intentional. But once our fingers touched, once his hand closed gently around mine, it felt like something irreversible had happened. We didn't speak for a while after that. The silence was gentler this time, filled with understanding instead of avoidance. I could feel his hand, warm, grounded, steady, and I couldn't bring myself to pull away. It felt too significant, too honest. When he finally did speak again, his words were fragile. He admitted he didn't know how to navigate any of this. The feelings, the uncertainty, the fear of hurting me or making something worse. It was the kind of honesty that didn't come easily, and it landed in the pit of my chest like a stone. I looked at him, seeing not just the younger brother who used to trail behind me at the park, but someone entirely different. Someone who had grown up beside me through years of shared chaos, who understood parts of me even I hadn't fully explored. And in his eyes, I saw something mirrored, confusion, hesitation, but also that quiet hopefulness that had always defined him. We stayed like that longer than we should have. Our hands entwined, our thoughts loud and spiraling. I tried to convince myself that this was just a moment, something that would pass. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake replaying the moment outside my door. The way his hand had squeezed mine just enough to tell me he meant every word. I stared at the ceiling, trying to reason with myself, to box up the feelings and label them as fleeting. But the pull inside me refused to be organized. The next morning, I found him in the kitchen. He was standing by the sink, his back to me. When he turned, I could see something unspoken in his expression. He was searching for reassurance, or perhaps for evidence that I hadn't disappeared into distance and denial. I smiled at him, or at least tried to. It felt hollow. His question came, quiet but unflinching. Not a confrontation, just a need for truth. Was I avoiding him? I wanted to say no. I wanted to say I was fine, that we were fine. But the words stuck. I offered a half answer, something vague and unsure. He nodded like he understood, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of hurt. The kind that came not from anger, but from caring too much. In the days that followed, the tension didn't ease. If anything, it deepened. We shared meals in silence, passed one another in hallways like strangers who remembered being close. I hated how familiar he felt, and how unfamiliar this new closeness had become. I hated the way my chest tightened when he sat too near, or how the absence of touch felt more unbearable than the touch itself. But most of all, I hated that a part of me didn't want to go back to how things were. Something had changed, and it wasn't going to fade. In the days that followed, our lives seemed to resume their familiar rhythms on the surface. Yet beneath it all, something had undeniably shifted. There was a subtle gravity that drew Rowan and me into the same spaces, lingering in doorways, brushing past one another in narrow halls, reaching for the same cup or towel with just a second's difference. These were the kinds of moments that might have once gone unnoticed. Now, they burned quietly between us. It wasn't something we discussed, not even in glances, but the energy between us had become almost impossible to ignore. I found myself catching my breath when he entered a room, feeling the hairs on my arms rise at the nearness of his presence. It wasn't overwhelming, not yet, but it was there, pulsing in the quiet corners of every shared room, every long pause, every breath held too long. There were nights when I found him sitting out back beneath the fading sky, and I'd join him without speaking. The sun would set behind the trees, casting warm gold across his face, and we would sit in silence, pretending we were just two brothers finding peace in the quiet. But I knew we were both listening to something inside us that neither of us wanted to name. It was in these unspoken hours that the bond between us deepened, not in words, but in shared stillness. One evening, the air was cool enough to raise goosebumps along my arms, and Rowan offered me a blanket without a word. His hand brushed mine in the exchange, and for a moment we both stilled. The touch lingered longer than necessary, but neither of us pulled away. The stars came out slowly, pricking the sky one by one, and I let myself imagine a world where this moment was simple, where we could sit like this without the weight of unspoken fear or guilt or confusion. But reality always came back, and with it, the tightness in my chest that reminded me this wasn't that world. As much as I wanted to lose myself in the quiet glow of what we shared, the truth loomed larger with each passing day. We were suspended in a fragile space that couldn't hold forever, and I began to wonder how long we could keep pretending we hadn't crossed a line we could never fully uncross. One afternoon, I watched Rowan from across the living room. He was flipping through a magazine, but not really reading it. His gaze drifted off and unfocused, like he was somewhere else entirely. I recognized that look. It mirrored my own reflection far too often these days. The couch between us felt like a canyon. I wanted to say something, anything, but I couldn't bring myself to speak. There was too much at stake. So I stayed quiet, clinging to the stillness as though it might give me answers. That evening, our parents were out again. We ended up alone in the living room, pretending to watch a film neither of us cared about. The screen flickered in front of us, but my focus was on the space between our hands on the cushion, close but not touching. The quiet thickened until I could barely stand it. The sound of my own breathing seemed too loud, too sharp. I felt Rowan shift beside me, and though he didn't say a word, I could sense something building, something fragile, barely restrained. Eventually, the silence fractured. His voice was low, almost swallowed by the quiet. I heard the weight in it more than the words themselves, and I answered him with equal softness. No elaborate explanations, just truth in its simplest form. His hand reached for mine, fingers brushing lightly. The touch wasn't accidental. This time, it was deliberate, gentle, uncertain, but real. A quiet question wrapped in warmth. I didn't pull away. I let my hand settle into his, my fingers curling instinctively, almost protectively. The moment stretched, each second heavier than the last. I could hear the clock ticking in the hallway, each beat marking the passing of something we'd never get back. When he leaned in, it wasn't sudden. It was slow, careful, as though giving me time to stop it. I didn't. His lips brushed mine with such tenderness that it almost undid me. It wasn't rushed or desperate. It was a whisper of a kiss, one that spoke of trust, of fear, of longing so deep it had nowhere else to go. It should have felt wrong, but all I felt was the stillness, the softness, the way my chest ached with the sheer intensity of being seen. The kiss deepened gradually, not in passion, but in familiarity. His hands rested on my sides, grounding me, holding me in place as though anchoring me to a moment we both knew couldn't last. When we finally parted, our foreheads touched, breath mingling in the quiet. His eyes were closed, and mine soon followed. We didn't speak. There were no words that could hold the shape of what we felt. Later that night, I lay awake again. Only this time, it wasn't confusion that kept me from sleep. It was clarity. A clarity I hadn't asked for. I knew then that whatever we were, whatever we had allowed ourselves to become, couldn't be easily erased. I could still feel his touch on my skin. The memory of that kiss lingered like the echo of a song I wasn't ready to stop hearing. There was no going back now. No matter how much we tried to pretend otherwise, the line we'd tiptoed along had faded beneath our feet. In the silence that followed, I found myself wondering not just how we'd gotten here, but how we'd ever find our way out. In the days that followed, nothing looked different on the surface. The kitchen still smelled like morning coffee. The hallway still echoed with quiet steps, and the same wind brushed against the windows each night. But beneath the daily motions, something had begun to slowly fracture. Rowan and I no longer sought out the quiet intimacy that had consumed us. We didn't avoid each other, not entirely, but something unspoken told us to pull back. The moments that used to burn between us had cooled into something quieter, more cautious. A silent understanding grew in place of the connection we had once allowed ourselves to explore so freely. It wasn't that the feelings were gone. They weren't. They had simply become too real, too heavy to carry. The more we tried to return to the way things had been before, the more painfully obvious it became that we couldn't. I found myself clinging to normalcy, filling my days with routines and obligations. I spent more time outside, more time reading, more time pretending that everything was still simple. But it wasn't. The memory of Rowan's touch lingered in my skin, the echo of his voice in the back of my mind. He was everywhere, even in silence. He moved around the house differently now, more slowly, more cautiously. His presence no longer rushed into a room, but waited quietly, as though unsure of where it belonged. When we crossed paths, our eyes met for the briefest seconds, just long enough to acknowledge the past, but not enough to get lost in it. We no longer sat close on the couch. The gaps between us widened in every space we shared, as if physical distance could undo what had already been felt. At night, I would lie awake, retracing every step that led us here, wondering when the inevitable shift would come. And then one evening it did. We were in the living room again, surrounded by fading daylight and soft lamplight. I had been trying to focus on a book, but the words blurred together, meaningless. Rowan sat across from me, staring at nothing in particular. The air between us was still, heavy with a sense of something ending. Without warning, I set the book aside and looked up. My voice felt unfamiliar as it broke the silence. The question had been building inside me for days, maybe longer. I asked what we were going to do. He didn't flinch. He didn't look surprised. He only nodded, as if he'd been waiting for the moment too. His voice was quiet, steady, but I could hear the sadness beneath it. He said he didn't know, that whatever came next, we would face it together. But those words, once comforting, now felt like a farewell wrapped in hope. I wanted to believe we could protect what we had found, that somehow we could keep it hidden in the safety of silence. But I knew better. The world would never understand. And even if it did, the weight of what we carried between us had already begun to press down harder than either of us could hold. That night, as I lay in bed, my mind refused rest. I thought about the moment his hand had found mine, the way our breaths had synchronized during that quiet kiss, the steady warmth of his presence beside me. It had all been real, and beautiful, and impossible. I realized then that love, true or not, wasn't always meant to stay. Some connections, no matter how deep, belonged to a particular time and place, unable to exist beyond them. Ours had arrived like a summer storm, unexpected, overwhelming, and fleeting. In the days that followed, the distance between us deepened. We stopped reaching, stopped pausing in doorways, stopped searching for each other's eyes. Conversations became brief and polite. The moments of tension that had once crackled with possibility now passed like shadows on a wall. Familiar, but no longer tangible. And then, one evening, the final moment came. We sat together in the dim glow of the living room, neither of us pretending anymore. I turned to him, the words forming slowly in my throat, heavy with finality. I said it was time to let go. There was no argument, no protest, just a long pause and then a nod. His hand rested on mine one last time, warm and steady, a gesture filled with meaning that didn't need to be spoken. We sat like that for a while, the silence stretching softly between us. I could feel the ache settling into my chest, a quiet grief for something we both had known couldn't last. Before I left the room, he reached out gently, brushing a tear from my cheek. That simple motion, tender and unhurried, felt like the closing of a chapter. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't need to. From that point on, everything began to shift. We started to live like people who had once shared a secret too powerful to speak of again. There were no more long evenings, no quiet glances, no brushes of hands in the hallway. Just the dull ache of something beautiful, folded up and tucked away where no one else could see it. We didn't talk about what had happened. We didn't need to. It lived in the spaces we no longer filled together, in the stillness of our mornings, the separate orbits of our routines, the unspoken promise that we would protect each other by letting it go. And so in silence we did. Time, as it often does, began to smooth the sharp edges of memory. The intensity that once defined every moment between Rowan and me dulled into something quieter, less urgent, but no less real. We returned to the rhythm expected of us, walking side by side, but no longer touching, speaking but never naming what had passed between us. In public, we were what the world knew us to be, brothers, friends, two people who had grown up together through storms and silence. Nothing in our interactions hinted at the fire that had once burned low and quiet in the corners of our shared space. We had buried it beneath layers of normalcy, letting the routine cover over the rawness. But even buried things leave marks. Sometimes, when he passed me in the hallway, I would catch the brief flicker in his expression, the kind of look that carried the weight of memory. It was gone in an instant, replaced with something neutral. But I saw it, and I knew he saw the same in me. There were no more nights spent side by side, no more shared glances in the dim light of a quiet living room. The spaces where we had once sat close now stayed empty between us, as though they had become sacred, places we no longer dared to enter. We began to grow in separate directions. I buried myself in studies, new responsibilities, and the simplicity of predictable days. He found other interests, other people, other paths to follow. It wasn't a rupture. It was a quiet drift, like two boats caught in opposite currents, pulled gently but surely apart. And yet, despite the space between us, there was still a tether, something soft and invisible, stretched across the silence. It didn't ask for attention. It simply remained. I often wondered if it would fade completely, if the years would erase the details, soften the weight of what we had felt, until only fragments remained. But the truth was, some memories resist that kind of erosion. They stay not because we cling to them, but because they became part of us. Years passed. He moved to another city. I followed a different path. Family gatherings came and went, filled with polite conversation and shared smiles. No one ever suspected the quiet history hidden behind our careful gestures, and we never gave them reason to. There were moments, though, unexpected ones, when it all came rushing back. A familiar song, a certain kind of quiet, the way the light fell across a room in early evening. In those moments, the distance collapsed, and I felt it all again. The warmth of his hand, the unspoken ache, the quiet beauty of what we had almost allowed ourselves to believe in. I never resented what happened. I never wished it undone. What we had shared, brief as it was, had come from something real, something deep and complicated and human. It had shaped me in ways I didn't fully understand until much later. And I knew it had shaped him too. We never spoke of it again, not in words. But sometimes, when our eyes met across a crowded space, there would be a flicker of recognition, an acknowledgement of a truth that didn't need retelling. As life carried us forward, the closeness we once shared became a story only we knew, a chapter quietly tucked away behind everything else. It lived in the margins of our lives, quiet and unchanged, waiting in the spaces between heartbeats. Eventually, we each found our own kind of peace. Not the peace of forgetting, but the peace of carrying something precious without needing to explain it. We moved on, yes, but always with the memory folded gently inside us. There was a time, not long ago, when we ended up sitting together on the porch again. The sky above was cloudless, and the evening air carried the weight of everything unsaid. We didn't speak of the past. We didn't need to. But when his hand rested near mine on the railing, just close enough to remind me of what had been, I didn't pull away. I didn't reach either. We simply let it be. That was enough. Because some connections aren't meant to be lived out loud. Some belong to silence, to moments between moments, to the spaces we hold quietly within ourselves. And in that silence, there was no shame, no regret, just remembrance, just the quiet truth that, for a time, we had something extraordinary, something fragile and untamed, something that refused to be bound by names or rules. And though life moved forward and the world turned as it always does, I knew that a part of me would always belong to that chapter. To him, to the version of myself I had discovered when the world was quiet and everything else had faded away. Some loves aren't built to last, but they never truly leave.